Welcome to another Ossett History Revision podcast with your head of history, Mr. Otway. In this podcast, we'll look at the settlement of the West by homesteaders, including the laws passed by the US government to help this happen. We'll then focus on the problems faced by homesteaders and how they overcame some of those problems. So first of all, why did people start to move west onto the Great Plains themselves? Well, fear of the potential for Mexico, Britain and France to try to claim or reclaim some of the land they had previously owned in the American West, and a belief in manifest destiny, led to the US government encouraging settlers on the Great Plains, through declaring all of it as public domain land. People were able to buy land for just $1 per acre, but this led to speculators who went out onto the Great Plains, looked for what might be useful farmland, arable land, and bought acres of it for the incredibly cheap price of the $1 as set by the US government. Then they went back to the cities in the east and tried to sell it on to people at a profit. To prevent the speculators taking advantage of the situation, the government passed the Homestead Act of 1862 that allowed families to have a whole 160 acres of land for nothing, and having lived on the land for 5 years, they could then buy it for just $30. The stipulation that you had to actually live on the land stopped speculators. The Timber and Culture Act of 1873 recognised that 160 acres wasn't always enough, and families were allowed up to 320 acres instead, if they promised to plant trees in half of the second 160 acres. One final law to be aware of was the Desert Land Act of 1877, which recognised that in areas in which it was difficult to grow anything, 640 acres of land would be allowed to settlers. So the government encouraged immigration, or migration, not immigration, they encouraged migration across to the Great Plains, and they then brought in more legislation which could help people who were moving there, and stop speculators, of course. Going and setting up a farm on land that has never been farmed before, in the middle of nowhere, with nobody to help but your own family, would be hard enough in itself. But there were a number of further problems that homesteaders faced as they tried to make a life for themselves out on the plains. I'll list some here that you might use in your exam. One major problem was that there were often no trees to be found on the Great Plains. This was a huge problem because it meant there was no wood to burn for heat or cooking, but perhaps more importantly, there wasn't any wood for building. The homesteaders satisfied their need for fuel to burn by using dried cow or buffalo dung, which burnt well, but wasn't particularly hygienic and didn't burn for very long. The government helped in 1873 when passing the Timber and Culture Act, which required homesteaders who took 320 acres of land to set aside some land for growing trees. We've already mentioned this in the last section. The lack of building materials forced the homesteaders to build sod houses, which were houses made from sods of earth. In other words, dried mud houses, which you can remember because there must have been a sod to clean. This brings us nicely on to a second problem, which is closely linked to the solutions to our first problem: hygiene. It would have been just about impossible to keep a sod house clean. There were insects living in the walls and floors. The homesteaders couldn't simply nip down the local shop to buy cleaning materials, as the nearest shop might be hundreds of miles away, and all this added up to make quite an unhygienic environment. There was also the issue of giving birth, which most homesteaders had to do with no midwife or doctor. Giving birth was extremely dangerous for both mother and baby in the 19th century world in general, but for the homesteaders, the risk was even greater, especially when you had the whole hygiene problem. Education was a further problem, particularly because of the large distances between homesteads. School marms were appointed to live on the plains and teach in sod schools. These women often lived with one of the families of the children she taught, was paid very little, but did make a significant difference in making the West a more civilised place. Now we're going to turn our attention to the agricultural, farming problems that the homesteaders faced. Trying to work land that has never been farmed was a huge problem, as it needs ploughing. But the tough, compact soil and the often deep roots of grasses meant that the cast iron ploughs homesteaders brought with them often broke, and time was lost mending them over and over again. There wasn't a solution to this for the first homesteaders. Ploughing the land was going to be hard, time-consuming, and back-breaking work. Thankfully, the railroads began to bring machinery from the east that was capable of ploughing the land effectively for the homesteaders, eventually, but for the first homesteaders, it was going to be a nightmare. Water was often in short supply on the plains, and was obviously vital and needed in fairly large quantities for farming to be successful. It was estimated that an average of just 38 centimetres of rainfall fell on the plains each year, which was not enough. Initially, most homestead families had to dig a well, but this was expensive and an uncertain business. Often several wells had to be dug before a usable water source was found, and this wasn't always reliable. It wasn't until many years later from when the first homesteaders arrived, the 1880s, when ranchers had begun using the wind pump to extract water from the water table deep underground, the homesteaders had a solution to the problem: wind pumps. They quickly adopted the wind pump, and thus they could finally access a reliable water supply. Machinery would be needed to dig the deep holes for the wind pump, and in this respect the homesteaders were again to be thankful, oh so thankful, to the railroads. In the harsh climate of the plains, which was another problem, the farmers initially stuck to attempting to grow the crops they knew best, such as maize or spring wheats. But these crops didn't take well to the hot summers and freezing winters, along with the high winds, and harvests were rarely good as a result. That was until 1874, when some Russian migrants brought with them some Turkey red wheat, which had been successfully grown in the harsh plains of Russia. Soon, Turkey red became the favoured crop for homesteaders. It could stand those really hot summers and freezing cold winters and still produce a great harvest. Finally, there was the problem of fencing the land. There was no wood to build fences, and there's no point in trying to grow hedges. We've established it's not easy to grow things, and all the water was needed to grow the crops. This meant it was often difficult to establish claim to a particular land, and disputes arose between homesteaders and ranchers, and you'll hopefully learn about that when you're revising about law and order. Again, however, the railroads, hooray, brought the solution with barbed wire. The homesteaders were given a difficult task, particularly those that first made the journey. Thankfully, by the 1890s, many of the problems faced by homesteaders had a solution, and the government had made things easier through passing acts such as the Timber and Culture Act of 1873. I've been Mr. Otway, Head of History at Ossett Academy, and this was another Ossett Revision podcast.